My son was killed in 1999. Armed robbery. Shot him and killed him. And he was running away. So, but from Chicago.
The forum will come to order, please. To welcome everyone and thank them for being here. Our speakers, thank you very much for being here. Our fellow members and guests of the committee, thank you. We're here today because 203 days ago, the House passed bipartisan gun violence prevention legislation, and the U.S. Senate has done nothing. After every mass shooting that makes the headlines, Leader McConnell says it's too soon to talk about policy. Unfortunately, there have been more mass shootings this year than there have been days in the year. If we wait for a day without gun violence to talk about it, we'll be waiting forever. The Senate Leader McConnell hopes if he waits us out, we'll just go away. Well, we're not going away. We're not going to go away because children are dying and the trauma is scaring an entire generation. As of this week, 500 children under the age of 11 have been killed or injured by someone using a gun. Over 2,000 kids between the ages of 12 and 17 have been killed or injured by someone using a gun. Almost every child in America has experienced an active shooter drill. Schools are now being designed to give kids hiding places because Congress refuses to act. This is shameful. We're here today to call on the Senate to act on H.R. 8 because our children are dying and a generation of kids is scared to go to school or a concert or to church or to a festival. It doesn't have to be like this. Senator McConnell has called himself the Grim Reaper. He was referring to a legislative graveyard. Sadly, that legislative graveyard is leading to more real graveyards. People are dying. Children are dying. Senate inaction is unacceptable. It's time for the Senate to put children first and vote on H.R. 8. Now I'm going to introduce the panelists that you'll hear from. Each panelist will have 4 minutes to make your presentation. Anything else that you'd like to give us, we'll take and we'll make available to all the members and will be put in the record. And after that, I'll recognize the members for 4 minutes each for them to ask their questions. And to my colleagues, just a reminder that your 4 minutes will be allotted for your questions or statements and the panelists' responses. We have a hard out, and we must close this forum no later than 2 o'clock or as early as when votes are called. Our first witness, and this will be the order in which you'll testify, Dr. Garen Wintemute. He's a leading expert on the public health crisis of gun violence and has conducted extensive research on the topic and is the Susan B. Parker Stephen B. Terrett Chair in Violence Prevention at the University of California at Davis. Destiny Philpott is a youth leader and active member of Students Demand Action. Destiny is from Baltimore and has been exposed to gun violence since the age of 7. Ray McMurray is the Secretary-Treasurer of the American Foundation of Teachers. He taught in Texas public schools for 18 years and is a gun owner. Leslie Boggs is the National Parent-Teacher Association President. She's a mother, grandmother, and a child advocate. Colonel Edwin Rosler is the Chief of Police in Fairfax, Virginia, and is a member of the Mayor's City Chiefs Association. Thank you again for being here, and Doctor, we'll start with you.
Mr. Chairman and members, thank you. I am a practicing emergency medicine physician and director of the University of California Firearm Violence Research Center. Firearm violence is among America's most salient health problems. In the 10 years ending 2017, civilian fatalities from firearm violence, and I include both suicide and homicide here, civilian fatalities from firearm violence exceeded American combat fatalities in World War II. Firearm homicide and suicide are both increasing. Homicide by 32% since 2014, suicide by 41% since 2006. Mass shootings are changing the character of American public life. We think twice before we venture into public spaces, the mall, the movie theater, our place of worship. We make escape plans. We wonder if it's safe to bring our children. And indeed, children are at risk. In that same, in that same 10-year period, we lost 14,313 children under the age of 18 to firearm injuries. Firearm-related deaths among American children have increased by 44% from 2013 through 2017, an increase of 11% per year. Comprehensive or universal background check policies receive extraordinarily high levels of support from the American public. We learned just last week that nearly 90% of us support comprehensive background checks, with differences of less than 5 percentage points between gun owners and non-owners, between Democrats and Republicans. There is little question but that background checks and denials of purchase by high-risk persons reduce risk of violence among the individuals whose purchases are denied. However, carefully conducted research has often not found a population-level impact on firearm violence of comprehensive background check policies. This poses a paradox. How is it that a policy that is effective on the persons directly affected seems not to have a population-wide benefit? The answer can be found in significant flaws in the design and implementation of comprehensive background checks policies up to this time. There are, in fact, 9 important problem areas. I will just mention one of them today. Consider the public mass shootings in Sutherland Springs, Texas, Charleston, South Carolina, Virginia Tech University. The shooters in all those cases were prohibited from purchasing firearms. They were nonetheless able to do so because background checks did not identify them as prohibited. The necessary information was simply missing from the data. Underreporting of prohibiting events appears to be widespread, such that there are likely many thousands of persons who are prohibited, but whose prohibitions will not be detected by background checks if they seek to purchase firearms. And as you know, reporting of these data by state and local agencies is voluntary. That said, the situation has improved. Several of the studies, including those by our group, suggesting a lack of population-level benefit from these policies, were conducted on data that are 15 to 20 years old and more. I think it's entirely possible that similar studies conducted on more recent data would yield positive results. And fortunately, very detailed information on these shortcomings and on recommendations for their improvement has been compiled under the auspices of the Bureau of Justice Statistics. A summary of this information will be appearing in the peer-reviewed scientific journal Health Affairs in 2 weeks. I am optimistic that a properly designed and implemented system of background checks would do much to reduce access to firearms by prohibited persons and reduce rates of firearm violence. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Destiny?
Good afternoon. What do you see when you look at me? My name is Destiny Philpott, and I am a 19-year-old non-binary person from Baltimore, Maryland. I am currently enrolled at Baltimore City Community College, where I major in English and minor in political science. I became a victim to gun violence when I was 7 years old. At the age of 9, I saw my first dead body. This has been the norm in my life since birth. I've been plagued with the generational curse of normalized gun violence. I have lost 5 friends to guns this year alone, and over a dozen in my lifetime. I sit before you today, not as a statistic of youth in Baltimore, but rather a pillar for the voices of Black and brown youth that have been disproportionately affected by the lack of regulations of guns within our communities. In Maryland, firearms are the #1 leading cause of death amongst children and teens, and Black youth are 5 times more likely than their white peers to die by guns. Just a few weeks ago, 4 people, including 3 teens, were involved in a quadruple shooting that left my friend, 16-year-old Milton Carrington, dead. According to the Baltimore Sun, as of this month, there have been over 222 reported firearm homicides in 2019, 11 under the age of 18. As a youth that has lived with the plague of gun violence, I sit before you today to say that it is impossible to combat gun violence without addressing the root causes of this issue that stems from economic injustice and institutionalized racism. Gun homicides, non-fatal shootings, and exposure to gun violence reflect and intensify this country's long-standing racial inequities. But the reality is the media is carrying on a century-long narrative of demonizing and criminalizing poor Black and brown communities. This same narrative has been used as an excuse to justify mass incarceration and the terrorism that Black and brown folk experience at the hands of police in our colonized neighborhoods. Instead of addressing the root causes of intercommunal violence, such as heteronormative patriarchy, capitalism, imperialism, colonialism, trauma, and manufactured poverty, to name a few, and dealing with the contradictions of state violence, the government and corporations, mainstream media asserts that Black and brown people are the problem. Deliberate policy decisions, particularly a history of housing discriminations and redlining, have resulted in segregated neighborhoods and underinvestments in Black and Latinx communities. Black people are disproportionately more likely to be victims of gun violence. Gun violence is made worse with the easy access to illegal guns. Our goal is to prevent interstate gun trafficking and hold gun dealers accountable. However, we can't continue to criminalize Black and brown youth with so-called tough-on-crime bills that add to mass incarceration. A federal background check law would prohibit people from buying guns by requiring background checks for all gun sales. State laws requiring background checks for all handgun sales are associated with a 48% lower rate of gun trafficking in cities and a 29% lower rate of gun trafficking across state lines. We can't forget that suicide with a firearm makes up 2/3 of gun violence. For suicide attempts not involving a firearm, less than 5% will result in death. But for gun suicide, more than 85% will result in death. Every day, future leaders are taken from us. My friend describes losing someone to suicide as an unbearable pain incomparable to anything she's ever felt before. Gun violence continues to steal mothers, fathers, sisters, and brothers. When Connecticut passed a law requiring all handgun buyers to pass a background check, both at the point of sale and as part of a permit process, it was associated with a 15% reduction in the suicide rate. I am grateful that the House has already passed these common sense gun safety bills. Now the Senate must act. My story stems from economic injustice and the lack of regulations in my community. If we implement background checks, it won't hurt anyone, but it will save lives. It could have saved Ray, Aaron, Milton, Webby, and Manny, but we waited too long and now their families and communities have to pay the price. My story is hard to swallow, but it is a reality that my community faces every day. I do not want your pity, though. I want you to act. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're really sorry for your personal loss. Mr. McMurray?
Violence on students and educators, from the shocking and gruesome Columbine experience to what seems like countless episodes of innocent lives being mowed down in cold blood. Educators, students, and community members have seen their schools turned into violent crime scenes and war zones in terrifyingly unacceptable ways. In my home state recently, we witnessed domestic terrorism at the hands of a white nationalist perpetuating a hate crime resulting in mass murder. Only weeks later, police officers and innocent citizens were killed cruelly and unnecessarily at the hands of a sick individual who should not have been able to access a firearm. AFT colleagues from Douglas High School in Florida, Sandy Hook in Connecticut, and countless schools across the nation where gun violence doesn't make the nightly news agree that the trauma and anxiety gun violence creates will simply not vanish, nor will it be stopped with bumper sticker gimmicks calling for armed teachers. More must be done now to provide mental health supports to students who have experienced trauma. More must be done to invest in programs like community schools, peer counseling, wellness programs, and school-wide practices to reduce bullying behavior. And more must be done to prevent dangerous individuals from buying firearms. Congress can help or continue to do little or nothing, further allowing children across this country to live in fear of gun violence. We must work to pursue and implement common sense solutions to reduce violence. One of those most common sense solutions is expanding the background check system. The system stopped the shooter in El Paso from arming himself in 2014. An expanded background check system might have stopped him from buying the arms he used to slaughter Texans last month. I know members of Congress before me here today have already helped to pass legislation out of the House of Representatives. So really, when I say Congress needs to do something, I'm speaking to my home state senators. Every elected official in this country takes an oath to protect and to defend its people. But too many have fallen down on the job, and we demand they do better. My senators need to understand that our teachers refuse to believe that nothing can change. We will continue to demand that thoughts and prayers be met with policy changes. And we will hold accountable every single legislator who stands in the way. It is time for Senators Cornyn and Cruz to exhibit true leadership on this issue. There are common sense, rational policy changes that can reduce the chances of guns getting into the hands of the wrong people, while still protecting the integrity of the Second Amendment. For the record, I am a seventh-generation Texan. My family has roots in the Texas Revolution. I do firmly support the Second Amendment as an integral part of the Bill of Rights. I'm a gun owner and a concealed permit carrier and holder in the state of Texas. However, I know that my Second Amendment rights are not threatened by expanded individual background checks. There is a path forward to better protect our society, and I am here to ask the senators from Texas to get it right, and I appreciate your service. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Ms. Boggs.
Chairman Thompson, Vice Chairs, and all members of the Gun Violence Task Force. Thank you for the opportunity to speak here today and for the task force leadership since 2012 to push for legislative action to reduce gun violence in our country. I am here today on behalf of National PTA, the nation's oldest and largest child advocacy association, with members in all 50 states, DC, the U.S. Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, and Europe. No parent should fear for the safety of their child every time they leave home for school or anywhere else. And no child should live in fear every day wondering if this is the last day they will see their family. Since 2013, there have been 471 incidents on school grounds. Thousands of children across this great country have been victims of a witness to gun violence in their homes, schools, or communities. At PTA, we have issued so many statements on mass shootings at schools over the years that we now keep a draft on file at all times. In every statement, we remind the nation that our students deserve to have a safe environment in which to learn and thrive. In every statement, we urge Congress to do more. Now is time to act. Doing nothing is unacceptable. This August, I published an op-ed asking Congress to return from its summer recess to enact common sense proposals, such as passing red flag laws, universal background checks, funding for gun violence research, and banning assault weapons, all of which a majority of Americans support. Unfortunately, Congress chose not to return to DC this summer to address this epidemic. So here I am today, again, asking for change on behalf of children and our families. Universal background checks can and will save lives. This common sense measure would have saved 7 lives and prevented injuries to 25 people in my hometown of Odessa, Texas. It would have prevented traumatic injuries to Anderson, the 17-month-old daughter of our family's assistant pastor, Kelby. Anderson is a toddler. The only pain she should have known should be from scraped knees when she was learning to walk. Instead, little Anderson was shot through her bottom lip and tongue and lost all of her front teeth because a man was able to purchase a semi-automatic rifle thanks to a loophole in our federal gun laws. Kelby was just going about her typical Saturday afternoon errands when Anderson was shot in the backseat of her car. As a mother and a grandmother myself, I cannot imagine the fear that she felt in that moment. when her daughter was shot and her other child sat in the back seat next to her, horrified. Kelby did everything she could do to protect her twins, but there was nothing she could have done to prevent her baby from being shot by a man who should have never had a gun in the first place. I've heard the arguments that no matter what you do or what laws you pass, there will be those that will break them. I get it, I really do. You can make that argument with speed limits. People break them every day, but does that mean we don't need them? No, they prevent accidents. They save lives. We need speed limits just like we need universal background checks. So my question today is, do our elected officials, including our president, value our nation's children and families enough to put a law in place that protects them the best that it can? Or will they continue to do nothing? To be clear, National PTA is not about taking away an individual's Second Amendment right. What we are about is ensuring that there are laws that eliminate the current background check loophole for gun shows and private sales and online sales. My husband was a former police officer in Texas, and every member of my family is a gun owner. Gun ownership is not the issue here. The issue is the ease of access to firearms and assault weapons, especially for those who pose a danger to themselves and others. Our association is so appreciative of the House's passage of H.R. 8, which our association endorses. Now it's the Senate's turn to act. Last week, I urged Senate Majority Leader McConnell to bring forward Senate Bill 42 to the floor and facilitate its passage in the Senate to address our nation's gun violence epidemic and protect our children and families. Today is a day for action. The Senate needs to pass, and the President must sign this bill as a reasonable first step to addressing gun violence in our country. Thank you so very much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much. Colonel, you're recognized for 4 minutes.
Good afternoon, Chairman and Task Force members. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to speak. I'm here today not only as the Chief of Police of Fairfax County, Virginia, but as a member of the Major City Chiefs Association, and more importantly, as a parent of 3 children that are productive community members in our society. I urge all of us to make sure that our representatives take action to combat the mass shootings and the gun violence in our country. These tragic events are profoundly plaguing our nation and cutting short precious human lives, especially the young people of our communities. I submit this plea to you on behalf of the Major City Chiefs Association, the brave officers that we lead throughout this nation that serve our communities. As a Chief of Police of Fairfax County, I'm proud that my county, of every major jurisdiction in the U.S., is the safest place to live, work, play, and grow old. However, gun violence is present in Fairfax County, and I wanted to start with 2 examples from the recent year. 2 tragic cases, both the same, unrelated to each other, but the same. A young mother takes a firearm and kills her 2 young children, and then uses the gun as a mechanism to have death by suicide. One in McLean, Virginia, one in Great Falls, Virginia. Unacceptable. This trauma needs to stop. And the Major City Chiefs Association and the American people have looked to the United States Congress and the White House for many years to take a leadership role in passing common sense measures to keep firearms in the hands of law-abiding Americans and out of the hands of those who will do harm to our families, friends, neighbors, and everyone that we love in our community. We urge you in the strongest possible terms to immediately act to reduce the trauma of the everyday gun violence and the slaughter of innocent people during what feels like a never-ending episode of mass shootings in our country, in our schools, entertainment venues, places of worship, businesses, and homes. We have supported and fought for legislative initiatives that would help us keep our communities safe, but for too long, politics and special interests have stood in the way of life-saving actions. The Major City Chiefs Association strongly supports H.R. 8, requiring background checks for every firearm sale, but we believe that this is just a start of what needs to be done. We call on Congress to move forward with broad legislative response, and we call on the President to support this effort. The Major City Chiefs Association joins the collective voices of millions of Americans who are demanding universal background checks, red flag or extreme risk measures, a ban on high-capacity magazines, and a host of other common-sense legislation that will keep our communities safe. As additional research is conducted on gun violence and mass shootings, we've begun to view this violence as a public health issue, not just a law enforcement issue. This has broadened the thinking on our strategies that can be employed to combat gun violence in our communities. Action aimed at keeping guns out of the hands of people with intent to do harm is needed now. Requiring universal background checks is merely a good start. Restricting access to firearms through age restrictions, safe storage requirements, and extreme risk laws will build upon H.R. 8. The Major City Chiefs Association has long supported other measures that would combat gun violence. We thank you for this effort here today, and we also appreciate the effort of the alcohol, tobacco, and firearms agents throughout this country, and H.R. 8 will help all of us in law enforcement collectively work with our advocates and our community members to make America safe from gun violence. We share these recommendations with you and also understand there are critics of H.R. 8, and we tell you that universal background checks will not stop gun violence, but the fact is it will stop some gun violence. There is no one strategy that will stop unlawful killings by firearms in our country. However, combining a number of legislative initiatives, we can go a long way in our ability to save lives, just like the lives of those 4 young children. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Colonel, and thank you for being a cop. 7 years ago, this task force was established by then leader Pelosi because the Congress wouldn't do anything about gun violence. They wouldn't hear our bills, they wouldn't give us a vote, they wouldn't give us a hearing, absolutely nothing. So Leader Pelosi created this task force. Today, Speaker Pelosi has been on the tip of the spear making sure that we pass sensible, pro-Second Amendment gun violence prevention laws that will keep our communities safe. I'd like to recognize the Speaker for a statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Your work as chair of the Gun Violence Prevention Task Force and the distinguished leadership that you have attracted as your co-chairs and other members are making a difference in our country. 90% of the American people support H.R. 8, our common sense background check legislation, and I appreciate the testimony of witnesses today. My apology for not being here at the start. The Speaker has to open the House at 12 o'clock noon. That's a time certain, and greet our visiting chaplain. But I have read your testimony, Mr. Wintemuth, and I appreciate what you said in there. Mass shootings are changing the character of America's public life. Thank you for framing it in that way as we challenge the Congress and the President to do more. I did hear Ms. Philpott's testimony, and you're so sad that you lost friends, 5 friends, maybe more in terms of injuries, but 5 friends. And this is Mr. Thompson's focus has been on protecting the children, hence the name of this impact on gun violence on children and the need to pass universal background checks. He is joined in that by Congresswoman Kelly, who has been a champion on saying, while our hearts break and we mourn and we want to act upon the high-profile events that have taken lives in our country, we must remember that every single day in our cities and across the country, we lose young people to gun violence. Thank Mr. Phillips, a newlywed, of here, taking the time, but just married this weekend, but this was very important for him to be here. Bobby Rush has been a victim of gun violence in his own family. The list goes on from all of our distinguished members who consider this of the highest priority. I also want to acknowledge the work that Mr. McMurray talked about to ensure domestic tranquility. Yesterday was the birthday of our Constitution. Yesterday was the birthday of its ratification. And in it, as you know, as you quote, in the beautiful preamble, to ensure domestic tranquility and provide for the common defense. That's our purpose. Let's get it done. I thank you for that. And also, Ms. Boggs, thank you. Yes, we did call upon the President to call upon the Senate to come back in the summer and pass H.R. 8. Our House members were prepared to mark up bills in committee until the hurricanes came on the East Coast. So now they have already marked them up first priority back. But thank you to the PTA for what you're saying. And the question we're asking today, do elected officials, including our President, value our nation's children? On that, our families and children, let me just say this. On Sunday marked 200 days since we sent the legislation, H.R. 8, to the President of the to Mitch McConnell, to the Senate. So Leader Schumer and I called the President on Sunday, and we said 200 days, 100 people a day on average, 47 of them children or teenagers. Please encourage the Republican leadership in the Senate to take up this bill and sign this legislation to save lives. Since it was Sunday, I said to the President, as always, I pray for you, I pray for your family and your safety. And I also pray that your heart will be open to protecting the families, other families in America, other children in America whose lives are at stake, at risk, in the cultural change that we have in our country. So that's why I was so pleased to see the Major Cities Chiefs Association, your testimony here today, Colonel, but also the letter that you sent earlier, so that we could say law enforcement, teachers, healthcare providers, PTA, young people, doctors, healthcare providers, as I mentioned, all support this measure. Gun owners, 90%. President's, some of his advisors say, well, it's going to hurt politically. There isn't the survival of one political person is not worth the survival of our children. And they have to know that. So I thank you all for your testimony. What I told the President is he's going to let us know what he decides. I said, but you understand, we're not going away. We're not going away until the job is done. We want to kick open that door with H.R. 8 and 1112, the timing issue. And there are more things that we can do. But what will save most lives in the shortest period of time right now is to pass H.R. 8 and 1112. And we hope that the President will give a positive sign to doing that. But understand your power, your testimony. It supports, one of you said, we're tired of, was it you, Mr. McMurray, right, about hopes and prayers or whatever. Mr. Thompson has declared himself a very prayerful person and thoughtful person that he is. We have to act, and we cannot use hopes and prayers as any excuse for not acting. So thank you for the generosity of spirit, for taking the time to make the case, to strengthen the case, and I thank the chairman for his distinguished service. And yield back my time.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Now the members will be recognized for 4 minutes to inquire of the witnesses, and we'll start with Mr. Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Speaker, to my task force colleagues, and particularly to our witnesses, thank you for being here today. Destiny, you used the word normalized in your testimony, and I want you to know that we cannot and we will not let gun violence in America become normalized. And we cannot and we will not let the majority leader of the United States Senate obstruct the will of the American people. And I'm saddened and frankly appalled that we even have to have a hearing like this today. But it is a beginning, and I'm grateful to all of you for being here. You know, I can't believe we now live in a country in which our children have to be subject to active shooter drills in schools, and I cannot believe we live in a country in which parents have to consider buying their children bulletproof backpacks to go to school. I'm one of those parents, a father of 2 daughters now in college. The fact that I have to think about them if they go to a concert, when they go to the store, or when they go to their college classroom is something I will not tolerate. And to that end, my first question is to you, Mr. McMurray and Ms. Boggs. Please talk to us about the emotional toll, psychological toll on the health and well-being and even academic achievement that just the fear of gun violence in schools is having amongst children and also teachers.
Thank you for the question. As I mentioned before, we had a shooting in my hometown, and so I'm witnessing firsthand what we're experiencing in our schools and how it's impacting them and the students that they serve and the families they serve. I have a goddaughter that goes to middle school, and she used to walk home to her grandmother's every day. It's like 2 blocks away from the school. She no longer can do that any longer because the fear and the trauma that she's felt by witnessing the shooting that happened in her community, she no longer feels safe. And so when you ask me how children and families see, you not only see students that are now afraid and question everything that happens within and around their schools, but you also see parents who are no longer able to walk up to a school to retrieve their children. They're keeping them in auditoriums and then call them out to the cars because they are fearful of what might happen in their community. I see lockdowns happening. I see schools that have become more of a fortress and a prison than a welcoming environment to thrive and learn. And this is happening across the country, not just in my hometown and my community. But you see students that are dealing with it every day. And it impacts them not in a short term, not just when the mass shooting happens, but for years to come. And I find it very sad that we have now the opportunity to create change, and yet we are still battling this change. Would you like to go ahead?
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. You know, I did teach and coach in the Texas public school system for many years, and I remember the day that Columbine happened, and I was in Texas, and that was in Colorado. But that unleashed really a generation of students that I think were exposed and have been exposed to a level of violence and distrust where they're growing up in a whole different set of circumstances. But I remember that day that I walked into that classroom and the elephant, it was what do you say? You look those students in the eye and you have to talk about that. I had to address what just happened. I didn't know that it was gonna happen over and over and over again over the next 10, 15, 20 years. But that day, I remember looking at my students for the first time, and it was no longer just about me and those students and what we were learning and the culture of really being an educational academic environment. You know, having to deal with those kind of issues and then wonder, now with this student, what is under that coat or jacket? You know, it changes the dynamics of what we're producing and who we are, what we're about. What does it mean to be an education academic institution? What are we teaching our kids? All of that culture is fundamentally changed.
Thank you very much. The gentleman's time has expired. Ms. Kelly, you're recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. According to the National Center for Injury Prevention and Control, more than 31,000 men, women, and children die annually from gunshot wounds in the United States, and we know that sometimes it's 35,000, 36,000. All too often, communities that I represent across the Chicagoland area face shootings daily, as you've heard. In 2019 to date, Chicago has more than 330 homicides from gun violence, and I'm sure edging toward at least 1,800 shot, with already 24 homicides in the month of September. A recent study on gun violence found that the loss of quality of life, psychological and emotional trauma, decline in property values, and other legal and societal consequences stemming from gun violence costs an estimated $174 billion, with the government absorbing $12 billion in costs. These funds should be an investment in communities, providing more economic opportunities for our youth and strengthening police-community relations. The cost of gun violence and lack of economic opportunity doesn't just hurt our families, it creates a void that is too often filled with negative and sometimes violent behavior. Last Congress, I introduced the Urban Progress Act, or UP, that would help fill this void in economic opportunities, strengthen police-community relations, and promote common-sense gun violence prevention policies. One additional area to explore to systematically address gun violence, as my colleague talked about, is to increase mental health access for those who have been affected by traumatic experiences around gun violence. I wanted to ask Ms. Destiny her thoughts around that, because we hear so often schools don't have social workers or counselors anymore. There's not the access.
So in my testimony, I spoke on a generational curse, and around that generational curse comes generational trauma. And there's a quote that, especially in Baltimore and in cities like Chicago, we have broken people raising broken people. And I want to emphasize that because Baltimore is not a bad place, it's just broken. And gun violence is so multifaceted, I feel like it's ignored to the extent where we're trying to find one solution, and there's no one solution to every problem. And so the only true recourse to stem and prevent violence in Black communities are to implement resources within those communities that they lack. And like Representative Robin Kelly was talking about, trauma-informed resources are greatly needed within our school systems. So yeah, back to the broken people raising broken people. It's a cycle of reoccurring trauma. And like, so for me, I've dealt with trauma, I've lived trauma. So without the proper help and necessities to therefore treat that trauma, then I began to implement trauma onto other people. So if I wasn't a person who was sane in myself and in my mind, I could therefore cause trauma to someone else, and that's how the cycle of trauma continues. And so if in schools we were to implement trauma, make schools trauma-informed and provide wraparound services within these schools, we therefore decrease the amount of violence that happens within those schools and in those communities.
Thank you. I just wanted to get a question into the doctor. Is there any specific data targeting urban communities on mental and physical trauma care, best practices to curb gun violence that we see across urban communities?
The data are not specific to urban communities, but we do know that the consequences of experiencing violence with a firearm are more serious and more long-lasting than are the consequences of experiencing violence with some other weapon or with no weapon. Firearms are different.
Okay, thank you. And just for the record, Colonel, background checks will help.
Yes, they will. A great start. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Rush, you're recognized for 4 minutes.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman. Next month, in October, is the 20th anniversary of the killing of my son Huey on the streets of Chicago. He was shot down in an aborted armed robbery attempt. And 20 years later, I can still hear the squeal of his mother when the doctor pronounced him dead. That primal scream that only a mother can make, it still penetrates my consciousness. And this is a question I have for any of the panelists who would like to respond. Too many of us have been directly impacted by gun violence, whether it be a family member, a loved one, a classmate, or a beloved colleague that may have been killed. It feels like a sense of worthwhile humanity, the emotional toll, the vacuum that's created and caused by this senseless sudden loss of life. All this is lost. And it seems as though no one really hears the pain and the squeal, the sense of loss. We hear folk, talking heads in the media. We listen to the empty-headed, empty-minded, empty suits that are supported by the NRA that espouse this insensitive garbage about how guns don't kill people, people kill people. And we all know that this is nothing but total nonsense. But what gets lost in these conversations about gun violence is the human toll, the suffering of family members, the community, friends, this sense of horror and emptiness that's caused by the instant loss of life of a loved one, of young people who had so much promise that was taken away far too soon. So I'm planning to introduce a legislation to establish a national memorial or even a museum dedicated to these victims so that they become not just a statistic, not just a number, but a life lived and a person loved. I'd like to get your response to this idea of a memorial or a museum.
Thank you, sir. On behalf of my colleagues, including myself, we engage with our community members on an annual basis with our victim services staff, our domestic violence detectives, to make sure that, one, we never forget those that lost their lives to gun violence and other homicide victims. And we light candles at a memorial service in the community. We do 5K walks, and we leverage the advocates, just like we're doing today in our local communities, to stop the violence. And the missing piece, obviously, is the legislative effort. But you're absolutely right. We cannot forget those that perished in this unfair trauma inflicted upon the United States. And a young community member from Baltimore here, traumatized, but she's doing something about it. And we need to do more. And informing people of the trauma is a great start.
Thank you very much. Mr. Snyder, you're recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for organizing this hearing. I want to thank all the witnesses for coming here and both courageously, passionately, and eloquently sharing your perspectives, telling your stories. Ms. Philpott, to experience what you've experienced, I cannot imagine. In my own personal story, I am named after my mother's uncle. My Uncle Samuel was murdered in 1943. When I decided to run for office 70 years later and raise the issue with my mother and her siblings about talking about my uncle, it was as if I had took a Band-Aid off an open wound that never healed, because they never do heal. And what we're seeing in our schools, in our public places, in our workspaces, a greater frequency and intensity of mass shootings. More and more families are having that experience. More and more families are, as you said, Ms. Philpott, the broken communities, broken people. We have a responsibility as a nation and within our communities to help restore these families, to give them the ability to find comfort and to continue to build. But we also have a responsibility to take measured steps to try to reduce this gun violence. That includes background checks. That includes closing the loopholes that allow people like the Charleston shooter to acquire a weapon. It includes new laws on trafficking across state lines and straw purchases. there are things that we can do and we need to invest in the research as a nation. But I'd like to ask the panel is, what also can we do to empower our communities? And Ms. Philpott, if I can start with you, because you're there in the community with young people, what more can we do for you and your fellow students, fellow young people, to empower you to make a difference?
So as an activist, a youth activist in Baltimore, I always talk about resource availability and restorative justice and housing justice and economic justice within Baltimore. We see deficits within our school systems, buildings that are falling apart. You can't have a substantial amount of kids that want to be in school in circumstances like that, or coming from communities where they might not be able to leave out because there was just a shooting right down the street from their school, or their mother or father was just shot, like my friend Milton. There's a lot that my community needs. There are so many different viewpoints that we have to look at if we're going to address the root causes of violence. Like I said, there's no one solution to every problem, because if you want to address every problem that happens in urban communities like mine, you have to be willing to address the root causes of violence. And so it's a long list and a long standing of what we need to do and the steps that we need to take. But I think the first step is providing resources in these communities.
Thank you. Chief, let me turn to you, and I'll ask it in two questions. The first is a fairly basic question. Would passing H.R. 8, the background check bill that this House passed more than 200 days ago, would that help? And then are there other things we can do to empower you and people in your position to reduce gun violence?
Absolutely, passing H.R. 8 will help. And the other things that we can do were just stated bluntly by my colleague here. When we look at our community and the root causes of violence, obviously the availability of guns is the #1 leading cause of the violence. But my peers and I, as law enforcement officers, we need to engage with everybody else in the community and our local government and state government and federal government to bring the resources to heal the community, whether it's public housing, the fear, anxiety, partnerships with schools. We need to be in the fabric as law enforcement leaders and officers with everyone, and together as a community to have safer environments to travel to and from school, as the examples given here today, safe classrooms, and to produce productive community members. It's all our responsibilities. And if we start with restricting the ability to have a gun in an illegal manner, that's a great start.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. And I know for me, 75 years after my uncle's death, we continue to fight to make progress, and I honor his memory. I promise you, Ms. Philpott, will honor Milton's memory and the memory of all your friends. Thank you.
Thank you. Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Sarbanes, you're recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for convening this hearing and for your leadership of the task force. And I want to thank our witnesses for coming today. As many of you have pointed out, what we need right now desperately are profiles in courage. And we need to see that on the Senate side. We need Mitch McConnell to stand up for the 90% of Americans who want to see these common sense gun safety measures put in place, rather than assisting in holding us hostage to the 10%. It doesn't make any sense. It's incomprehensible, and it's indefensible, the position that he's taken. This House has acted, as you know, with H.R. 8 and H.R. 1112. We did it early. It was actually the first major piece of legislation that was passed in this Congress by the House of Representatives was H.R. 8 to put in place universal background checks. And so it's been months and months and months that we've been waiting for the Senate to act. And as many of my colleagues have said, we're not going to let up, as Speaker Pelosi indicated. We're going to keep the pressure on. part of the reason I have some confidence and optimism that that is going to make a difference this time is because of the advocacy that's coming from people like those of you who are testifying today. Fundamentally, it's about whose side are we on? Are we on the side of Americans who become increasingly fearful about gun violence in every community? And we need Mitch McConnell to stand on the side of our citizens who want to see these measures put in place. You often hear people say, and there was an allusion to this earlier, that, you know, universal background checks aren't going to solve everything. That's true, but it'll make a difference. Destiny, you mentioned that, or you observed that universal background checks are not going to hurt anyone, but they can save a lot of lives. The thing that makes me most frustrated when we have these high-profile, tragic mass shootings is the sense of powerlessness that follows in their wake, which I think is corroding at the psyche and spirit of the nation. That we can't seem to do just one thing after these tragedies, just one thing. Are we that weak? Are we that powerless? And so while passing a universal background check will not solve everything, it will solve that sense of powerlessness we feel, because it'll show that we actually can do something. We can begin to fight back. Just 30 seconds left, but Destiny, thank you for being here. Thank you for fighting on this issue. Thank you for fighting for Baltimore. I love that city the way you do, and I'm proud to represent it. Real quick, do you feel like some of your peers are becoming motivated by the kind of action you're taking, and that together you all are making a difference and can make a difference?
By amplifying the youth voice, yes. When they see that we are able to come out and we are able to use our voices to make a change, it motivates them to want to come out, because sometimes we feel so voiceless, and understanding that we do have a voice that has power makes them want to get out and do more to implement change within our communities.
Thank you. Thank all of you. I yield back.
Thank you. Dr. Ruiz, you're recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I cannot emphasize strongly enough that this is a public health issue. And as an emergency physician and public expert, I am heartened to see a fellow emergency physician and public health expert on our panel today. Dr. Windmute, thank you for sharing your moving story, and thank you for your work to save lives. You and I both have seen the realities in being in the front lines when victims of firearm violence roll into our emergency departments, and we've worked to save their lives. We've mourned with their families. When the medical care can't overcome the devastation of a bullet, we're the ones that usually have to tell the family members. And there's no other group other than the victims themselves and the survivors that can really experience that horrendous suffering that happens. But those are the stories that we take home and we contemplate for the rest of our lives as well. Taking a public health approach to firearm violence makes sense, and we've used a public health approach in this country before. We've used public health research to craft strong tobacco policy, and we saved lives in motor vehicle crashes. But when it comes to firearm violence, people are dying, and it's hard to come by good answers on how to prevent these deaths. So in your definition, what is your definition, to clarify it, of what a public health approach to gun violence is?
Thank you. The best articulation of that point of view I've ever heard came from Dr. David Satcher right after he took over as head of CDC. And he said to the New York Times, look, if violence isn't a health problem, then why are all these people dying from it? It really is just that simple. There are deaths, there are injuries, there are long-term consequences to those who are affected, to our community. We vastly underestimate those
So
consequences.
what does it mean to take a public health approach?
What it means to take that approach is to study this as if it were a health problem, which it is, to understand what the risk factors are at the individual and, as Destiny has pointed out, at the societal level, to understand how to intervene between risk and outcome so that risk factors don't necessarily mean that bad things happen. One way to do that is to enact comprehensive background checks, which will identify people who have risk factors, prevent them from acquiring the firearms with which they would do firearm violence. Can't shoot somebody if you don't have a gun to do it with. It is really that straightforward, and as you mentioned, it is a time-tested approach. We're using it at the moment for opioids.
So in other words, we use the scientific evidence to identify high-risk individuals, and we make sure that those individuals, like people who have shot somebody else in the past, don't get their hands on guns, right?
That's correct.
Okay, and so what else has the scientific evidence shown to help reduce overall risk and incidence of gun violence deaths?
Another time-tested approach is to broaden the criteria for prohibition. I'll give one example. There are others. In California, we have enacted a law that prohibits people who've been convicted of misdemeanor violent crimes from purchasing or possessing firearms for 10 years. In most of the country, it is simply a myth that people convicted of violent crime cannot legally purchase firearms. Our work has shown that that new policy reduced risk for violent crime among the people who are directly affected by 25 to 30%. That's a big difference.
And what further research would you like to see?
Oh, you ask a researcher that question. I will prioritize this. I don't think we know nearly enough about the consequences, the effects, again, not only on people who've been shot and their family members, but on the communities of people who care for the people who've been injured.
And in the world of prevention, what other research would you suggest?
I would like to see intervention trials where states, since Congress has not acted, states are again serving as democracy's laboratories, are enacting new policies in an effort to prevent violence. We need to see if those policies have their intended effects.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Pascrell, you're recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thanks for putting us together today. And you've done a lot of work over the last several months. This didn't just happen. I want to thank the panel. You're brave people to come to give testimony today. And Doctor, we're going to need you and people like you to convince. I get a charge out of people talking about the fact that, this is a sign of mental illness whenever there's a shooting. These are the same people who didn't really support mental health parity. And take a look, I'm not joking about it, this is serious business. Patrick Kennedy came to this House and led us, if you remember, to legislation dealing with the very things that you've been talking about, Doctor. Destiny, I project in 10 years, think about it, that you'll be safe and sound and still doing what you're doing and teaching us. Ray, as a teacher, you have a tremendous amount of influence. And the kids shall leave us. Parkland proved that children shall lead us. Leslie, PTAs and what they're doing now, because they understand the severity of the situation. Thank you. Colonel, I want to talk to you heart to heart. 28 years ago, as the mayor of the city of Paterson, New Jersey, I stood with Governor Florio on the steps of City Hall in Paterson to sign one of the first bans in this country of assault weapons. And as I went to City Hall that day, or to the police station, I'm sorry, I saw police on the top of the garages and buildings around City Hall. I walked in and I said to the public safety director, "What are they doing up there? It looks like an armed camp." He says, "It is. We've had threats on both you and the governor. So therefore, come and follow me." So I followed him into the police office there, his office, the director's office, and he gave me my first flak jacket. So you're going to have to wear this out to the ceremony in order to sign the ban on assault weapons. And so did the governor have it as well. My job, Colonel, my job is to protect you. My job is to protect every police officer. So while I'm functioning here about children and priorities, I want you to know that you are a priority. I do everything as the co-chair of Public Safety, the Congress of the United States, to get to that point, because you are our first line of defense. Background checks are going to help us. You know more than anybody else in this room how effective they are, how it helps you in an investigation. I know it's after the fact, but you're in place to do that. You need all the help that you need, besides a trained police officer, besides a well-armed police officer. Our policemen, Mr. Chairman, are outgunned and outstaffed. So those who yell law and order, and those who point out that these mental people out there are doing all of these things, and we don't have to worry about it, guns kill people. No, people kill people. That's their motto. Put it on a bumper sticker and see how many kids it saves. Say how many police officers it saves. So if I don't do my job, then you should get rid of me and put someone else in my place who can do that job. And I thank you for all your service. You've done a heck of a job here today, I'll tell you. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Evans, you're recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Thompson, for holding this hearing, and thank you for the witnesses speaking with us today. In 1993, the CDC study showed that bringing a gun in the home brings everyone to a much greater risk of gun violence. The NRA disputed the findings of the study in 1996. Congress revoked the CDC's ability to research gun violence as a public health issue. Earlier this year, thanks to Madam Chair of the Appropriation Committee, the House passed what would be the first federal funding for gun research in 23 years. I was proud to vote for that $50 million in its long term. Gun violence is a public health issue. Guns killed nearly 40,000 Americans in 2017. That's 40,000 Americans. As a comparison, nearly the same number of people died from breast cancer last year. Yet there's no dispute that breast cancer is a public health issue. Do you know what happens when we treat motor vehicle death as a public health issue? The number of motor vehicle deaths decreased by 45%. Doctor, in my home city of Philadelphia, there was 154 killings and 631 victims of gun violence in just the first 6 months of 2019, not to mention the thousands of family members and friends who was affected by death or injury of a loved one by gun violence. This, doctor, guns took the lives of 102 children and young adults in Philadelphia just in 1 year. This is why it is critical that the Senate address the issue as our chairman has indicated and what he has stated. This is a public health issue. The Philadelphia Inquirer recently did a story about this title called Shot and Forgotten, which I encourage everyone to read. Partly in response to that story, Senator Casey and I introduced the Resource for Victims of Gun Violence Act. We have 62 co-sponsors in the House, and I encourage all members to sign on. We must make sure that victims get the help they need. So, Doctor, why is it imperative that we provide resources for those affected by gun violence?
Because they're suffering. People who have been shot face long-term physical and psychological disability. The people around them face trauma, as we've heard, and are impaired in their social and emotional lives. Entire communities are adversely affected. I would argue there's a moral imperative that we would provide those resources. Let me double down. I think there is a moral imperative that we provide support for research. There is no such thing as intervening effectively with a complex health problem without understanding it. We don't fly blind when we go after breast cancer. We don't fly blind when we go after opioids or heart disease or motor vehicle injuries. But we are asking ourselves to fly blind when it comes to intervening and preventing firearm violence. That's just wrong.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for that time. I yield back to you. And again, I want to thank the chairwoman of the Appropriations, because it was under her leadership that we got that $50 million for the purpose of the CDC. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Mr. Clay, you're recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Let me start by saying that since April of this year, I represent St. Louis, Missouri, and we are quickly becoming known as the murder capital of America. And since April, more than a dozen teenagers and children between the ages of 2 and 17 have been killed by gun violence. So let me start with the Colonel. I heard you mention that it made sense for H.R. 8 to pass through the Senate and get to the President's desk, as well as the Charlotte loophole. Let me ask you, would it be helpful if local governments could determine their own firearms regulations instead of being dictated to by the states, their respective states? Right now, 43 states limit local government from passing more stringent firearms regulations than what is allowed by the state. Can I hear your opinion on that? Do you think local government would be a good place to start?
Yes, I agree. Local government is a great place to start, and Fairfax County's local leaders have already started that for years. And obviously getting past their General Assembly in Richmond is an obstacle. Obviously, Virginia is a gun right state, like many other states. But when we talk about the issues in the local level of these mass tragedies or individual tragedies, and we do the psychological autopsy, if you will, of the person that inflicted the violence, we're lacking legislation to prevent those. We know what these psychological autopsies, our homicide investigations, reveal to us. And when I talk to my peers across this country, through major city chiefs especially, our ability to also, on a national effort, report the tracking of firearms, such as transfers, the loss, or the theft of firearms, it's not consistent. I sit on the chair of the FBI's National Incident-Based Reporting System, and on an annual basis, we wrestle with that ability on a national level to track all of this. So yes, we need to take local action at the same time because we're not getting the federal action.
On the issue of open carry, and I'm not sure what Virginia's laws are, but I mean, do you ever get reports of citizens calling in and saying, "Hey, I saw somebody strapped with an assault rifle, carrying it open, or someone was carrying it a sidearm"? OPED. Do you ever get that? And don't the callers find that alarming?
We get those calls all the time in Fairfax County, Virginia, so do my colleagues in Virginia. It's open carry state. The key is to train your officers and your call takers to understand, to get as much tactical information as possible, because that too is a tragedy waiting to happen, because if our officers and dispatchers are not trained to get the information, we could unfortunately take the wrong action. So it's difficult. It creates fear in the community.
I can imagine. Mr. Chairman, my time is up.
Thank you very much. Mr. Costa, you're recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for your leadership in this important hearing, and the committee, along with the Speaker for her comments earlier during the hearing. I am one of the co-chairs of the Victims' Rights Caucus, and the Victims' Rights Caucus, a bipartisan effort here for years, deals with the effects of gun violence across America. And clearly what this committee is trying to do is not only pass meaningful legislation in Congress, but to shed a light and to try to coordinate a strategy that involves all of our society in America, because this is an epidemic. Yesterday, Fresno High student arrested for felt cute, might shoot up a school later post. Police arrested 16-year-old Fresno High School student Tuesday after the teen allegedly shared an Instagram post about shooting up a school. School administrator alerted authorities to the post, while police say it was a photo of a student with a caption, in quotes, "Felt cute, might shoot up a school later." Officers found the student on campus around 6:15 yesterday. The teen was arrested on suspicion of making criminal threats. Last year, I co-sponsored an effort with local law enforcement agencies, Fresno Unified School District, to provide updated school safety plans. We know about students now looking for bulletproof backpacks. We also did the same in Merced with local law enforcement agencies and school administrators and school groups. This is part of an overall effort. Yesterday, in the Merced, another community I represent, USPS employees shot in the head while walking home from work. It's everywhere, clearly. And Colonel, I appreciate your emphasis on the background checks, and you were also asked what else can be done, and you said clearly that there's multiple efforts on a strategy, because we know no single solution is going to solve this crisis in America. I guess I'd like the good doctor from UC Davis and law enforcement school. It seems to me what part is lacking, besides the frustration we all have here with the Senate, is how we weave together a cohesive strategy that includes all of the above. Would either of you care to comment?
One thread at a time, if I might. And one of those threads would be labeled extreme risk protection orders. I am responding to the anecdote you just mentioned. We know that 80% of the time, people who commit mass violence declare their intention to do so in advance. People have notice of this.
As is high school students.
Exactly right. In our state, California, and in 16 other states, people can do something. They can react to those threats, and law enforcement can take action. There is federal legislation pending to encourage other states to do this and to adopt a federal ERPO.
To your point, with Fresno Unified, it is the intention to protect against active shooters, bomb threats, or other acts of violence. School lockdown is a precautionary measure issued in a response to a direct or nearby threat. Requires staff and students, to respond quickly and comply with the rules.
We recently published a series of 21 cases in California in which extreme risk protection orders were used in an effort to prevent a mass shooting. None of those mass shootings occurred.
Colonel?
When I take the school example, best practices across this country, school resource officers are part of the fabric. Social media is where the threats are. We need to act on those threats, door knock, get them diverted into mental health services immediately.
Okay, thank you very much. The gentleman's time has expired. Ms. McBath, you're recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Thompson, and thank you so much once again for holding this really important hearing and forum as we continue to tackle the scourge of gun violence. And I want to thank each and every one of you that are sitting here today. Thank you for your courage. Most specifically, Destiny, thank you very, very much. It is critical to be able to hear your voices. Your peers are going to be key in helping to really eradicate what's happening across the country in unnecessary gun violence. So thank you for your courage and your fortitude to continue to be a voice of change. From school shootings to violence in our communities, children should never, ever have to live in fear of gun violence. I believe we are at a very critical moment for gun violence prevention. From expanding background checks to closing the Charleston loophole, all the things that have been mentioned here, to passing a federal extreme risk protection order. And thank you, Dr. Wintemute, for mentioning that. We are all finally taking action. Today, in the Education and Labor Committee, which I just ran in from, we did actually mark up the School Shooting Safety and Preparedness Act so that we can finally understand the problem of school shootings empirically. This will allow us to learn more about how we can protect our children and provide resources to our schools as we work to prevent these tragedies. And we must also continue to help our children who are facing gun violence away from school, in their communities, and even in their homes. We must make sure that we're protecting children from the gun violence that doesn't always make the news headlines, as you have mentioned yourself, Ms. Destiny. My question is for Dr. Wintemute. Would data and collection be a helpful first step in addressing our gun violence in schools?
Yes. There are very limited data on school shootings, violence in schools, more generally violence around schools, which is where much of the problem is located. And more generally, there are very limited data on the nature and severity of violence in the United States, gun violence in particular, and important sources of information that were used for research in the past have been taken off the table. It is now impossible to get access to data that were used in critical studies to understand the structure and function of criminal gun markets, for example. That research can no longer be done.
Thank you. And so would you agree then that the $50 million that's now been appropriated for the CDC and the NIH for gun violence prevention research, this information here, if we were able to collect this on school shootings, would be invaluable to being able to get to some solutions?
Absolutely. I think that amount would be a very good start.
Thank you. Ms. Boggs, you may be aware of programs like those that are led by Sandy Hook Promise that seek to reduce social isolation at school and to teach kids the signs of a person in crisis so that we can prevent gun violence. How can we support these types of programs, and what other steps can we take to empower our students, our parents, and teachers to prevent gun violence?
I think Congress has the opportunity to fully fund Title IV-A, which really is a comprehensive look at our school safety. I think parents and teachers and community members need to be a part of the conversation to really come up with what works for their specific situation and their communities. It's important whenever we look at where we're going. That collaborative leadership is really, really important, so I appreciate where you're going and what you're wanting to see happen. But I think, again, just fully funding what we have, plus what you mentioned, the $50 million, is a great step forward.
Thank you very much. Ms. Jackson-Lee, you're recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me thank all the witnesses for your presence here today. I could spend time with you longer than we've had the opportunity, and forgive me for stepping out. We're overlapping meetings, but I wanted to get back here to just personally say thank you. I'm going to run very quickly through my questions. Anyone that wants to answer, would you agree that providing $75 million in additional funding for the National Instant Criminal Background Check to help gun-status criminals, dangerous criminals, is important, that is a mere amount of dollars to improve that? Just go quickly.
Yes.
Colonel, not Colonel, but...
Absolutely.
Yes. Yes. Colonel. Yes. All right. Thank you very much. Let me also indicate that Dr. Shook of the Texas Children's Medical Center, in a gun summit that I had, said that gun violence and its aftermaths cost $300 billion. I'd like to ask Dr. Wintermute, could that money be used better for gun violence research, for gun violence issues dealing with mental health, rather than the $300 billion for the aftermath of violence?
Yes, it could be used for that and many other things. One example, if the trauma team is taking care of somebody who's been shot, that trauma team is not available to take care of somebody who's been in a car wreck. There are opportunity costs here.
I thank you. I've introduced the Santa Fe High School victims. Many of you are aware of that. Would you support the idea that to prohibit private purchase or sale of a firearm or ammunition except through a federally licensed firearm dealer to ensure, Colonel, to ensure the fair transaction of that gun?
Yes, to prevent all the loopholes, absolutely.
And additionally, Sabika Sheik was one of those who died in Santa Fe. The Firearm Licensing and Registration Act provides for the licensing of a firearm and ammunition possession. Would anyone want to comment on that?
Clearly, what we see in the gun violence is the majority of the people get the guns through other processes, street sales, or loopholes in the law. So that's where the weakness is.
And so licensing would be very helpful if that was a requirement. We also know gun trafficking impacts cities like Chicago, where my good colleague and friend comes from. And people make fun of cities like Chicago, Washington, D.C., L.A., but they understand that guns come in from other jurisdictions. And hopefully, licensing would be very helpful in that process.
It will reduce the illegal sales, yes.
Here's one that I have promoted since being a member of the Houston City Council. Every spring, when children are out of school, Colonel, and everyone else, you get a series of accidental shootings by the toddler, the 5-year-old, the 10-year-old who reaches into mommy or daddy's drawer under the bed. So I have a Kimberly Vaughn firearm, another victim of the Santa Fe shooting. Storage Act to require the safe storage of firearms and ammunition, and to require investigation and proper storage. I believe in the Bill of Rights. I don't want to take anyone's guns away. But I'd appreciate if anyone wants to just make mention of that is a sensible thing to have Americans do. And lastly, before my time runs out, Destiny, if you want to comment at the end, I only have 35 seconds. So someone want to say storage is valuable? Anyone on the record?
Yes, it is.
Anyone else?
Definitely so.
Yes.
Destiny, do you wouldn't just say how painful it is as a child to experience gun violence?
It's painful. It's embarrassing. It's incomparable to anything else I've ever experienced in my life. Seeing people dead, seeing, and excuse my language, brains on a bench outside of Baltimore, it's not something that I would wish on my worst enemy.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Swalwell, you're recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Destiny, just want to follow up and thank you for your advocacy, considering what happened to you and that you continue to lead this fight. How many funerals do you think you've gone to for gun violence?
The amount of funerals that I was supposed to go to, whether or not I was mentally capable of, I've attended 13 funerals for my friends, and that's in the last 4 years. There were 2 in which I did not attend because they happened back to back and I could not.
You've gone to 13 funerals for friends in the last 2 years who were
Yes.
killed by guns?
Yes.
Stopped with bumper sticker gimmicks calling for armed teachers. More must be done. More must be done now to provide mental health supports to students who have experienced.
And do your friends and you today worry that today could be your last day on earth because of the threat of gun violence?
If I'm being honest, a lot of us are scared, but a lot of us are so used to the idea that we just find it amazing that if we make it to our 18th birthday, it's just something that's like so casual, and like violence and death by guns is so normalized and we're so numb to it that we're like, I'm desperately working for that not to be a norm in my community, because a lot of us will think like, I could be next.
I went to Chicago a couple months ago, South Side neighborhood, and a young woman there told me that for most young men, the only time they'll wear a suit in their life is at their funeral. Is that kind of a sentiment that you see in Baltimore?
A lot of the times, yes, it is a sentiment that we'll see. And it's what's expected, but it's not the reality. And like I said, Baltimore isn't bad, it's broken. And a lot of people are doing, the necessary things. A lot of people do put on suits just to go to a job interview where they may or may not get the job, so.
And I guess I was just really addressing like the hopelessness that, so many people expect that before they're 18, they'll be a victim. So that's the sad side, and that's the real that you deal with every day. And you're strong, and you're here. Can you tell us what the time you have left, what people like you in your community and people like you, a young person across America, can do to make sure that people like my 2-year-old son and other people's children in America do not have to experience this in their schools, in their communities, anywhere where we gather? What can we do? How can we not live this way?
So, my friend Ray Glaslow III was murdered 3 weeks after we led a national walkout, CDC, a part of March for Our Lives. I think that the important thing to understand is that if we do go out and we do make our voices heard, then we will begin to implement change. And I'm not promising that it will come today or tomorrow or in 10 years, but we cannot afford to stay silent because we have a different narrative of what gun violence looks like and the solutions that we need to fix the problem. And a lot of us in Baltimore and in Chicago, because I work heavily with people in Chicago, we are desperately trying to implement and shift the narrative around gun violence so that it is inclusive, because gun violence is so multifaceted and we cannot afford to look at it from one angle and from one spec, and to simply want to implement one narrative into it. Because I might not know or have experienced mass shootings, but my friend has, right? And so the way that we go about it is the more that we implement each other's narrative, the stronger our argument is to implement this change into every community.
Beautifully said. Thank you, Destiny.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you all for your very thoughtful and helpful testimony. I think you could hear from the questions that the members asked. We're not giving up on this. We've passed the background check bill. We know that will save lives. We know it's important. You backed that up today. We're all committed to doing everything we can to make sure kids aren't traumatized the way that they have been traumatized. The idea of in your back-to-school shopping, you buy bulletproof backpacks is just ludicrous. We need to take action. Senator McConnell needs to take action. We've done our work. We've sent 2 good bills to the Senate that will save lives. Senator McConnell needs to do his job, take those bills up for a vote so we can help save lives. Thank you very much. We've been called to vote, so I'm going to gavel out at this time. And again, thank you very much. We stand adjourned.